A brilliant black engineer works in a prestigious tech company, but is treated as if he were invisible by white executives who dismiss his ideas. When the city's main digital infrastructure collapses, chaos threatens millions of lives, and only his ignored project can stop the disaster. Those who belittled him are forced to kneel and beg for his help, facing the weight of their prejudice. The alarms echoed through the skyscraper, shrill and merciless, as the giant digital screens flashed crimson warnings, system collapse imminent. Executives ran across the glass hall, their suits drenched in sweat, shouting orders that contradicted each other. Outside the windows, the city lights flickered dangerously, entire neighborhoods sinking into darkness. In that suffocating chaos, panic reigned supreme and no one seemed to have an answer. At the center of the storm, however, stood Elijah Carter, silent, ignored, and underestimated. His project, his invisible creation, was the only lifeline left, yet nobody had ever cared to listen. The CEO's voice cracked as he barked into the phone, demanding emergency assistance from government officials. His words dripped with desperation, but his eyes never turned toward Elijah as if he weren't even part of the room. Elijah watched them stumble, their arrogance dissolving into fear, and a bitter taste filled his mouth. For years he had endured the same look of dismissal, the same condescending smirks whenever he dared to present his designs. Now the city's fate trembled on a wire, balanced solely on the brilliance they refused to acknowledge. Monitors displayed failing grids in red waves, transportation shutting down, hospitals losing power, and traffic lights collapsing into chaos. Helicopters circled outside, broadcasting the disaster in real time, as newscasters shouted about an imminent catastrophe. The people in the city below were hostages of technology they trusted blindly, unaware that salvation already existed, buried in the ignored drafts of a black engineer who had never been given a seat at the table. Elijah's heart pounded, not from fear of the crisis, but from the cruel irony of it all. He was invisible until the world caught fire. Inside the boardroom, a young executive slammed his fists against the table, demanding answers. His voice carried the weight of privilege, certain that his commands deserved obedience. Yet nothing he proposed worked, and the system continued spiraling into destruction. Elijah inhaled deeply, knowing the fix was in his hands, but bitterness chained his voice. Why should he save those who had made him a ghost? Why should he extend his brilliance to men who laughed at him in meetings, who erased his name from credits, who introduced his work as their own? The memory of countless humiliations struck him like lightning. Presentations where his designs were met with silence, only to be praised when repeated by a white colleague. Casual jokes about his lucky spot in the company, as if his competence had nothing to do with it. Invitations to social events that never reached his inbox. Whispers in the corridor that reminded him of his place. He had built firewalls, networks, and futuristic prototypes, but none of it pierced through the walls of prejudice. To them, Elijah Carter was a shadow, an invisible engineer. The room reeked of desperation as executives flipped through useless manuals, their arrogance dissolving into frantic prayers. Elijah clenched his fists at his side, his mind replaying every ignored moment. He had begged for funding, begged for testing opportunities, begged to be heard. And now the very program that could stop this collapse, the Integrated Stabilization Protocol, sat gathering dust in a digital drawer, dismissed as too ambitious by the same voices now trembling in panic. The irony was sharp enough to cut his soul in two. Then a senior manager turned to Elijah, not out of respect but out of despair. His eyes were bloodshot, his suit wrinkled, and his voice cracked as he muttered, "Carter, don't you have some unfinished project? Some model that could help?" The words were bitter, reluctant, drenched in the taste of forced humility. Elijah raised his head, meeting the man's gaze for the first time in years without flinching. Yes, he had the project. Yes, he could save them. But the wound of invisibility pulsed too deeply for him to simply nod. Outside, chaos worsened. Ambulances froze mid-route, unable to navigate without functioning GPS. Trains stalled on tracks, passengers screaming in tunnels swallowed by darkness. The city pulsed like a dying heart, beating irregularly as systems collapsed one by one. On social media, hashtags exploded with panics, and our city shut down, son our tech collapse, gunners save us. Millions of eyes turned to the company, demanding salvation, unaware that salvation rested in the hands of the man nobody wanted to see. The weight of injustice was unbearable, pressing against Elijah's chest like a steel chain. The CEO finally turned, his voice stripped of pride, calling Elijah's name. For the first time in his career, Elijah wasn't invisible. Every pair of eyes in the room locked on him, waiting, pleading. The silence was suffocating, filled with a collective realization. The man they had ignored, sidelined, and humiliated was now the only chance they had. Their fear was raw, their arrogance shattered, but Elijah's silence cut deeper than their panic. He stood, calm, his eyes reflecting both rage and restraint. Whispers floated across the room. Can he really do it? Why him? Do we even have a choice? The executives looked like drowning men staring at a lifeboat they once mocked as unnecessary. Elijah heard every word, felt the sting of every doubt, but behind his calm face, his mind sharpened. He could fix the collapse. He knew the system better than anyone. After all, it was his design. Born in nights of loneliness, crafted in silence, fueled by the fire of rejection. They didn't know, but every line of code carried his soul. The tension cracked like glass. Time was running out. The city's final defenses were seconds away from total failure. Elijah stepped forward, his voice finally cutting through the chaos. I can fix it, but not the way you expect. His words froze the air, commanding attention with a weight no title had ever given him. For the first time, his invisibility shattered. The room leaned in, desperate, terrified, yet uncertain what price would be demanded for salvation. Elijah Carter was no longer just a ghost. He was the storm they had unleashed. The choice hung in the air like a blade. Should he save them despite everything? Or let the city collapse as proof of the cost of prejudice? His chest rose and fell, the room silent except for the deafening alarms. The moment was unbearable, suspended between vengeance and redemption. Elijah knew one thing: they would never see him as invisible again, and whatever happened next, history would no longer erase his name. The silence after Elijah's words was louder than the alarms. Executives exchanged nervous glances, their pride wrestling against desperation. No one wanted to admit out loud that the black engineer they had dismissed for years was the only one who held the key. But the truth was suffocating them, and the crimson flashes on the monitors gave no room for denial. Elijah's voice still lingered in the air, commanding more power than their highest titles. The collapse wasn't slowing. Every second of hesitation cost lives. Pride was now their greatest enemy. The CEO cleared his throat, his voice fragile as if swallowing broken glass. Elijah, if you have something, anything, we need it now. His tone was pleading, a stark contrast to the arrogance that once coated his words. Elijah's eyes narrowed and the weight of years of silence pressed heavily on his chest. He thought of meetings where his suggestions were waved away with a dismissive smile. He remembered the laughter, the condescension, the subtle exclusion that shaped his existence here, and now suddenly, his name was their last lifeline. Elijah turned slowly toward the massive screens, lines of collapsing code racing downward like waterfalls. He recognized every fragment, every failing module. He had warned them of this vulnerability months ago, during a presentation that ended in awkward silence and polite excuses. They had labeled him overdramatic, claiming the system was resilient enough. Now the so-called resilient network was crumbling before their eyes, and Elijah's voice was no longer theory, it was prophecy fulfilled. The bitterness burned in his throat, but his brilliance refused to stay silent. Your backups are useless, Elijah said flatly, his voice carrying like a blade through the room. The grid is eating itself from the inside. The only solution is the stabilization protocol I designed. The words hit them like thunder. A few executives muttered among themselves, some still reluctant to accept the truth. Why should we trust him? One whispered harshly, his eyes darting nervously toward Elijah. The hypocrisy of it twisted Elijah's chest. They had no choice but to rely on him, yet prejudice still dripped from their voices. Outside the glass walls, the city screamed in panic. A hospital lost power completely, the backup generators failing, leaving patients in darkness. A plane approaching the airport was forced to divert mid-air as systems failed to communicate. Police sirens blared without coordination, colliding in traffic gridlock. The chaos wasn't distant. It was pressing against the building itself, climbing the walls of their arrogance. The executives clutched their tablets like lifeboats, but their eyes kept sliding. He walked slowly toward the control console, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor. The executives parted reluctantly, their bodies betraying a hierarchy they never thought would invert. Elijah's presence was different now, heavier, undeniable. "Tell me one reason," he said calmly, "why I should save the same people who erased me." His voice wasn't angry. It was piercing, an accusation that silenced every whisper. The weight of truth made them lower their eyes. They had no defense. Prejudice had left them naked in the face of disaster. The youngest executive, pale with fear, stammered, We were wrong. We didn't see your value." His words were trembling like a child confessing to a crime. Elijah's jaw tightened. "You saw it," he replied coldly. "You just refused to admit it because of the color of my skin." The words stabbed through the room, undeniable, unrefutable. No one moved. No one spoke. The truth was too heavy, and the monitors continued their merciless countdown toward collapse. Every second felt like a verdict waiting to be pronounced. Elijah leaned over the console, his hands hovering above the keyboard. He could activate his protocol in minutes. He could stop the destruction before it spread beyond recovery. But his soul was torn in two directions. On one side was his city, innocent people suffering, lives at stake. On the other was the bitter weight of years of humiliation, the sting of being invisible in the very company that now begged at his feet. He had the power to let them taste the consequences of their prejudice. But at what cost? The CEO took a hesitant step closer, his voice breaking. "Elijah, I admit it. We were blind. We were arrogant. But please, this is bigger than us. Children, families, hospitals, millions are depending on this system. Don't punish them for our sins." His words cracked with desperation. The facade of corporate superiority completely shattered. For the first time, Elijah saw something in his eyes that looked like regret. But was it genuine remorse or just fear? That question burned like fire in Elijah's mind. A memory rose in Elijah's chest like a ghost. His mother's voice, warm and unshakable, telling him as a boy, "Never let their hate make you smaller, Elijah. Your brilliance will shine when the world least expects it." Those words echoed louder than the alarms. His mother had carried hope through storms, believing in a future where her son would not be invisible. Elijah's fists unclenched slowly. The city's suffering wasn't their fault. It wasn't the fault of the innocent. He couldn't let hatred write the final line of his story. He straightened his back, eyes blazing with a new fire. "If I do this," he said firmly, "things will change. My work will no longer be buried. My name will no longer be erased. And you will never again treat me or anyone else like they don't belong." His voice thundered with conviction, filling the room with an authority they could no longer deny. The executives nodded hastily, their fear palpable, their desperation transforming into fragile promises. But Elijah knew words were cheap. Actions would prove everything. The countdown on the screen blared a warning. Critical failure in 5 minutes. The city was seconds away from a point of no return. Elijah's fingers hovered above the keys, the entire boardroom holding its breath. For the first time, the power was his. Not given, not borrowed, but seized by the weight of reality. The invisible engineer was invisible no longer. He had become the axis upon which survival turned. And as the city burned outside, Elijah prepared to pull them all back from the edge or let them fall. Elijah's fingers froze above the keyboard as memories flooded back with merciless clarity. Years of humiliation cascaded through his mind like a cruel slideshow. He remembered walking into meetings with carefully prepared presentations, only to watch his slides skipped over with polite nods. Then minutes later, a white colleague would rephrase his idea, and the room would erupt in applause. He had smiled through the betrayal, swallowing the bitterness, because speaking out would have labeled him angry or difficult. Silence became his survival, but silence also chained him. In the cafeteria, his seat was often left empty, an invisible barrier surrounding him. Conversations stopped when he approached, replaced by awkward coughs and half-smiles. Invitations to team outings got lost in his inbox, and when photos circulated afterward, his absence stood out like an accusation. He laughed alone, ate alone, and celebrated victories in the shadows. For them, Elijah wasn't part of the team. He was a tolerated outsider, a ghost in a company built on unspoken rules of exclusion. The loneliness gnawed at him every day. Nights were his sanctuary and his prison. He stayed in the office long after the others had gone home, the fluorescent lights buzzing above him like cruel companions. Alone, he coded furiously, pouring his brilliance into lines of digital poetry. His projects, ignored in daylight, blossomed in secrecy at night. That's when the integrated stabilization protocol was born, not from applause or recognition, but from hunger, from rage, from the desperate need to prove he was more than the invisibility they forced on him. It was his rebellion in code, but the more he created, the more invisible he became. His managers praised his work ethic, but never his vision. They loved his silence, his reliability, his refusal to demand the spotlight. They used him like a machine, extracting ideas, polishing them, then rebranding them under someone else's name. He became a ghost they could not afford to lose, yet never wanted to acknowledge. The contradiction was suffocating, needed but never wanted, valuable but never valued. The weight of it pressed on Elijah until his soul felt crushed. His apartment was no refuge. He returned home to silence, the city lights outside flickering like distant promises. He rarely invited anyone over. How could he when even friendships in the office were poisoned by prejudice? At night, he stared at his reflection, wondering if he had become the ghost they treated him as. His eyes looked hollow, his smile strained. Sometimes he questioned if he was truly invisible, not just to them, but to the entire world. The thought haunted him, like a shadow he couldn't escape. He remembered the day he nearly quit. After yet another presentation where his work was dismissed, he had walked out of the office, his resignation letter drafted on his phone. Standing on the street, watching the stream of people rush by, he felt crushed by the realization that brilliance wasn't enough. His skin had already decided his fate in their eyes. He almost let it decide his fate too. But something inside him, maybe his mother's voice, maybe his own stubborn fire, refused to let prejudice claim victory. He went back in, yet the scars remained. Every meeting where his voice was drowned, every smirk, every subtle exclusion, they piled up inside him like stones, heavy and cold. Even when he laughed at office jokes, even when he pretended not to care, the truth ate at him. He longed for someone to say, "I see you, Elijah. I see your worth." But the words never came. And now as the city teetered on the brink of collapse, those same people looked at him not with friendship, but with desperation. The irony was unbearable. He thought of the whispers too. He's only here because of diversity quotas. He's good at technical stuff, but leadership? Not his place. The words floated in the air like poison seeping into his bones. Elijah had fought to ignore them, but deep inside, part of him feared they were right. That maybe no matter how brilliant he was, the world would never let him be more than invisible. That doubt haunted him more than failure. It was the cruelest wound of all, the one that made him question his own reflection. But in the darkness of his suffering, Elijah also discovered strength. He realized that invisibility gave him freedom to create without interference, to build something so powerful that one day they couldn't ignore him anymore. He crafted his protocol in silence, not for applause, but for truth. It was his weapon, his shield, his legacy. Even if they never said his name, even if he remained a ghost, the system bore his soul. It was proof that he existed, proof that invisibility did not mean absence. Still, the price of survival was heavy. He carried the exhaustion of being twice as good to get half as far, of biting his tongue when insulted, of smiling when his heart screamed. That exhaustion followed him everywhere, even now as the room begged for his brilliance. They saw him only when their empire cracked, when their arrogance collapsed. It wasn't respect, it was desperation. And Elijah knew the wound of invisibility couldn't be healed by a single moment of panic. The scars ran too deep for quick apologies. The alarms continued to shriek, but Elijah's mind was trapped in his past. Every humiliation replayed like a movie on fast forward. His silence wasn't hesitation. It was years of pain fighting against his desire to help. He wasn't a machine, programmed to save them regardless of how they treated him. He was a man, a soul carved by injustice, and now the world finally had to see it. Whether he saved them or not, they could never unsee the truth. He was no longer a ghost. He was the storm. Elijah's chest rose and fell, the decision weighing heavier with every second. He wanted justice, but justice had never been given to him. He wanted recognition, but recognition was always stolen. Now he wanted something deeper, to reclaim his existence. And in that moment of isolation and suffering, Elijah realized something powerful. His worth was never theirs to grant. His brilliance didn't need their approval. Whether he saved them or let the city collapse, he had already broken free of their invisibility. They would never erase him again. Elijah finally broke the silence, his voice cutting sharp as steel. "I'll do it. But on one condition, my name will no longer be erased." The executives exchanged uneasy glances, their pride twitching even as the city spiraled into chaos. The CEO hesitated, then forced a nod. "Of course," he said, the word tasting like poison. Elijah's chest tightened, aware of the insincerity hidden in their tone. He had seen this performance before. Promises were easy when desperation demanded them, but would they honor his condition once the storm passed? He moved to the console, ready to deploy his code. But before he could type, one of the senior executives stepped forward, blocking him. His face was pale, twisted with both fear and arrogance. "Wait," he barked. "We can't just hand control of the city to him without oversight." The words struck Elijah like a slap. Even as the city crumbled, prejudice clung to them like a disease. They would rather risk destruction than let a black man be the visible savior. The cruelty of it froze Elijah's blood. Another executive chimed in, his voice trembling but still poisoned by pride. "He should give us the code. We'll run it ourselves. If it works, fine, but if it fails, it's on him." Elijah's eyes burned with fury. They wanted his genius without his presence, his salvation without his name. The room murmured in agreement, their fear twisting into cowardice. It wasn't enough that he had been invisible for years. They wanted to strip him of his final chance to be seen. It was injustice sharpened to its cruelest edge. Elijah stepped back, his hands shaking not from fear but from rage. "You still don't see it," he whispered. "You'd rather let millions suffer than let me stand here as the one who saves them." His voice echoed in the sterile room, making several executives flinch. But one of them, with a smirk half hidden behind trembling lips, replied coldly, "Let's not get emotional. We just need the system fixed. Names don't matter." The hypocrisy stung like acid. For years, names had mattered. His had always been erased. The CEO tried to mediate, his voice wavering. "Enough, let him work." But the damage was done. Elijah saw it in their eyes. The doubt, the prejudice, the unwillingness to truly recognize him. They would use him as a tool, nothing more. If the city survived, they would rewrite the narrative, paint themselves as the heroes, and bury him deeper than ever before. He had lived this cycle too many times to believe otherwise. The injustice was not only in their words, but in the certainty of their future betrayal. As Elijah reached for the console again, the senior executive who blocked him leaned close, his voice low but venomous. "Don't forget your place. Do your job and don't expect applause. People like you should know better." The words sliced through Elijah's chest like a blade. Years of silent endurance threatened to shatter all at once. His vision blurred with rage, his hands trembling above the keys. The alarms screamed louder, but the real explosion was inside him. That single sentence was the purest distillation of every injustice he had ever endured. Elijah clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. He wanted to scream, to unleash years of swallowed words, but the weight of the collapsing city pressed harder. His voice cracked as he forced out, "My place? Without me, there is no city left to save." The words rang like thunder, silencing the room for a heartbeat. But instead of shame, he saw only discomfort in their eyes, the same unwillingness to confront the truth. They were blind by choice, shackled by the chains of their prejudice. Outside, chaos reached a fever pitch. Fires spread in darkened neighborhoods. Ambulances stood powerless and planes circled endlessly in the sky. The world was collapsing in real time. But inside the boardroom, the battle wasn't just technological. It was racial, systemic, personal. Elijah's hands hovered above the keyboard like a man holding destiny itself. Yet the injustice coiled tighter around him, suffocating. They weren't just asking him to save the city. They were asking him to remain invisible while doing it. That demand was unbearable. The youngest executive, trembling with fear, muttered under his breath, "If he doesn't give us the code soon, we're finished." Elijah caught the words, his chest tightening. It wasn't about trust, it wasn't about respect. It was about using him one last time before discarding him forever. The cruelty of it almost brought him to his knees. He thought of his mother again, her voice telling him never to shrink. But here they were, demanding he shrink even smaller, even as the world burned around them. Elijah's eyes filled with unshed tears, not weakness, but fury so deep it threatened to consume him. "You will not steal this from me," he said, his voice trembling with suppressed fire. "If I save this city, my name will not be erased. I will not vanish back into your shadows." The executives shifted uncomfortably, their silence a mixture of fear and resentment. For the first time, Elijah wasn't begging to be seen. He was demanding it. Yet still, he saw in their eyes the same resistance, the same poison. Then came the cruelest blow. The senior executive sneered, his voice slicing through the tension. "Fine, save the city. But don't fool yourself. Nobody out there will remember your name. People like you never get remembered." The words struck harder than any physical attack. Elijah felt his chest cave in, the truth of history pressing down on him. The countless invisible hands that built nations, invented systems, changed lives, yet were erased from memory. He wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting against centuries of erasure. The injustice reached its peak. He stood at the console, the entire city depending on him, yet still treated like a shadow, a tool, a nameless savior. Tears burned his eyes as the weight of centuries echoed through him. He wasn't invisible because they couldn't see him. He was invisible because they chose not to. And in that cruel moment, Elijah realized that saving the city would not erase the injustice. It would only expose it. The alarms blared their countdown, but the true collapse had already happened in their humanity. The alarms screamed louder, merging with the pounding of Elijah's heart. The massive screen displayed a merciless countdown, total collapse in 120 seconds. The entire boardroom was suffocating under the weight of imminent catastrophe. Executives shouted over each other, voices breaking in panic, but their words dissolved into chaos. Only Elijah stood still, his eyes locked on the console, fingers trembling inches above the keyboard. He was no longer just an engineer. He was the axis of survival, the man whose choice would decide whether millions lived or died. The senior executive who had mocked him earlier leaned closer, spitting venom even in desperation. "Do it already. Stop wasting time." His tone wasn't gratitude, it was command, dripping with the arrogance of a man who still saw Elijah as a servant. That single sentence snapped something deep inside Elijah's chest. Rage boiled through his veins, years of humiliation exploding all at once. He turned sharply, his voice thunderous. "I am not your tool. I am the only reason this city still has a chance." The room froze, silence cutting sharper than glass. The countdown dropped to 90 seconds. Outside the glass windows, the city was unraveling in chaos. Entire districts plunged into darkness, traffic collapsing into deadly collisions, hospitals reporting mass casualties over unstable lines. Helicopters lit the sky, circling frantically, broadcasting images of disaster across every news channel. Millions of people stared at their screens, demanding salvation, unaware that the savior was fighting not just against collapsing code, but against a lifetime of being unseen. Elijah's chest heaved as the weight of two wars crushed him, one external, one internal. Sarah, her eyes wide with tears, broke the silence. "Elijah, please, if not for them, do it for the city. Do it for the children in those hospitals. Do it for the families trapped in the dark." Her words pierced through his fury, pulling at the humanity that still lived beneath the scars. Elijah's jaw tightened. He wanted justice. He wanted recognition. But above all, he wanted to live in a world where innocent lives were not sacrificed to arrogance. The conflict tore him in half, every heartbeat a reminder of the impossible choice. The senior executive smirked again, his words dripping poison. "He won't do it. He's weak. That's why people like him never lead." Gasps erupted around the room, but the damage was done. Elijah's vision blurred, his breath catching in his throat. That single phrase carried the weight of centuries, echoing every time history had erased voices like his. His fist clenched so hard that blood dotted his palms. The countdown struck 60 seconds, the screens glowing red like fire. The world outside screamed, but the cruelest noise was the hatred inside the room. Elijah raised his head slowly, his eyes burning with a fire no one had ever seen before. "Weak," he whispered, his voice trembling with rage and grief. "You have no idea what strength looks like. Strength is surviving humiliation. Strength is being invisible and still building the system that will save you. Strength is standing here while you spit in my face and still choosing humanity over vengeance." His words shook the walls like thunder. For the first time, some executives lowered their eyes, shame flickering through their fear. The countdown dropped to 45 seconds. Elijah's hands hovered above the keys again, but his heart pounded with unbearable weight. He thought of his mother's voice, the hope she had carried for him. He thought of every night he coded alone, his brilliance hidden in silence. He thought of the people outside, strangers who would never know his name but would live because of his sacrifice. Tears blurred his vision, but his fingers steadied. The storm inside him was unbearable, but through it he found clarity. He would not let hatred define him. "Run the code," Sarah shouted, her voice breaking. Elijah slammed his fingers onto the keys, his code flooding into the system like lightning. The room vibrated with tension as lines of green text replaced red warnings. The network fought back, resisting his program. Sparks flying from the console as the system overloaded. Elijah's jaw clenched, his fingers moving faster than anyone could follow. He poured his entire soul into those lines of code, every keystroke a defiance against invisibility. The room shook with the weight of the battle between collapse and survival in seconds. The system roared like a beast, lights flickering, alarms wailing in deafening chorus. Sweat poured down Elijah's forehead, his muscles trembling with exhaustion, but he refused to stop. Every insult, every dismissal, every scar fueled his determination. Executives stood frozen, powerless, forced to witness the man they had mocked become their savior. Sparks burst from the console, the smell of burning wires filling the air. Elijah's voice tore through the chaos. "You will remember my name whether this works or not." 20 seconds. A massive blackout surged across the city, plunging everything into darkness. Gasps filled the boardroom. Had the system failed? Panic spread like wildfire, but Elijah kept typing furiously, eyes blazing. "It's not over!" he shouted, his voice carrying the authority of a commander. Outside, the city looked like a corpse, but inside the servers, his protocol fought like a hidden army. Every second was an eternity, the weight of millions pressing against Elijah's back. If he faltered, everything would end in flames. In seconds. Suddenly, a spark of green light appeared on the screen. Then another. Systems began reconnecting, power surging back, hospitals blinking to life, traffic lights resetting, communication lines stabilizing. Executives gasped, hope flooding their faces for the first time. Elijah's fingers blurred over the keys, his code racing faster than collapse, stitching the city back together thread by thread. Sweat drenched his shirt, but his voice thundered through the room. "Come on, hold!" The tension was unbearable, the outcome balanced on a knife's edge. Seconds. The screen froze. Every breath in the room stopped, the world itself holding still. For an endless heartbeat, silence devoured the boardroom. Then with a deafening hum, the monitors erupted in green. "System stabilized." The words flashed across every screen, echoed in every corner of the building, broadcast across the city. Outside, lights roared back to life, sirens silenced, hospitals cheered. Inside, the boardroom fell to its knees in stunned silence. Elijah collapsed back into the chair, his chest heaving, his hands trembling. He had saved them, but the victory tasted of fire and tears. The boardroom was silent, suffocated by the green glow of success. The city was alive again, pulsing with electricity, its heart beating stronger than ever. Executives stood frozen, unable to process the miracle they had just witnessed. Elijah sat slumped in his chair, sweat dripping down his temples, his hands trembling from the storm he had unleashed. He had saved them, saved millions, but the room was still heavy with something unsaid. Everyone knew it. The silence was no longer relief, it was guilt. Sarah finally broke the quiet, her voice soft but piercing. "Elijah, this wasn't luck, was it? You had this solution all along." Her words hung in the air, sharp as knives. Every executive shifted uncomfortably, their faces betraying the truth they all tried to ignore. Elijah lifted his head, his eyes burning with exhaustion and fury. "Yes," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I gave you the solution months ago. I begged you to test it. I warned you this collapse would happen. You laughed at me. You erased me." The revelation detonated in the room like an explosion. Gasps filled the air. The monitor's glow reflected their horror back at them. Richard, pale as a ghost, shook his head violently. No, that can't be true. But Sarah pulled up the archived files, her fingers trembling. There it was. Elijah's proposal, time-stamped, ignored, labeled as unnecessary and impractical. The silence became unbearable as the evidence glared back at them. The executives' faces drained of color. They hadn't just failed to listen. They had actively buried the very thing that could have prevented the disaster. Elijah rose slowly, his body shaking but his voice steady. You almost killed millions because you couldn't stand the idea of me being right. Because of my skin. Because you never saw me. His words were not shouted, but they pierced deeper than any scream. Executives lowered their heads, shame flooding their eyes for the first time. The truth was undeniable now. The city had been saved by the man they made invisible, and the disaster had only happened because of their prejudice. The weight of it crushed them like stone. Sarah's voice cracked as tears welled in her eyes. We failed you. We failed this entire city because of our blindness. She looked around the room, her gaze landing on Richard, whose face twisted in panic. He stammered, trying to defend himself. We couldn't have known. But Elijah cut him off, his words slicing like a blade. You knew. You always knew. You just didn't care. The room shuddered under the truth, and for the first time, Richard's arrogance crumbled completely. His lips trembled, his eyes wet with a fear that had nothing to do with the system. Suddenly, the glass doors burst open. A camera crew from the media stormed in, followed by city officials demanding answers. Who saved us? Who fixed this? Shouted the mayor, his voice booming with urgency. The executives froze, panic flashing across their faces. They couldn't hide anymore. The world wanted to know the name of the savior. For a moment, Richard opened his mouth to speak, ready to steal the credit as always. But Sarah stepped forward, her voice steady and loud. It was Elijah Carter. The man you all ignored, the man you erased. The cameras turned toward Elijah, flashing lights blinding him as microphones shoved into his face. He blinked, overwhelmed by the sudden attention. Reporters shouted his name, demanding answers, while the mayor grabbed his hand firmly. Mr. Carter, you saved millions of lives tonight. The entire city owes you a debt we can never repay. The words rang across the airwaves, broadcast live to millions of viewers. Elijah's chest rose and fell, his heart pounding. For the first time, But then he remembered his mother's words. Justice is not revenge. Justice is truth. He took a deep breath, grounding himself in dignity. If he chose to help them, it would not be for their sake. It would be for the sake of the law, for the sake of proving that he could not be broken. When court resumed, Michael stood tall, his voice steady and commanding. Every spectator leaned in, no longer laughing, no longer mocking, but listening intently. He dismantled the fraudulent claims piece by piece, exposing lies with precision and clarity. Each sentence struck with the weight of truth, leaving Richard Hale pale and trembling. The judge, who once dismissed him, now regarded him with respect, even admiration. The Harringtons sat in silence, their faces masks of shame as the man they had ridiculed became their savior. Michael did not gloat, did not smile, did not taunt. His strength came not from humiliating them, but from proving his worth beyond doubt. The courtroom had shifted. Michael no longer begged for a place, he had claimed it. Richard Hale tried one last desperate objection, his voice faltering. Your Honor, Mr. Carter is dramatizing. But the judge cut him off sharply. Enough, Mr. Hale, Mr. Carter has the floor. The courtroom gasped, the balance of power permanently altered. Michael pressed on, his arguments clear, concise, undeniable. With every word, the Harringtons' defense became less about wealth and more about survival. Edward's face burned crimson with shame, his arrogance stripped away while Catherine bowed her head in silence. Michael had done what no one believed he could. He turned the courtroom into his stage, not for theatrics, but for truth. His humiliation had been transformed into triumph. The echoes of laughter were replaced by silence, reverence, and shock. By the end of the session, the evidence against the Harringtons had been discredited. The judge commended Michael's meticulous analysis, acknowledging him publicly for his expertise. The gallery, once filled with jeers, erupted in applause, a sound that washed over Michael like cleansing rain. He stood still, his heart swelling not with pride but with vindication. The very people who had doubted him now celebrated his brilliance. Richard Hale avoided his gaze entirely, his reputation shattered. The Harringtons sat stiff, their wealth unable to shield them from the sting of humility. For Michael, the victory was not just legal, it was moral. He had shown the world that no amount of prejudice could erase the truth. The courtroom belonged to justice, and justice had found its voice in him. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed Michael, microphones thrust forward eagerly. "Mr. Carter, how does it feel to be the man who saved the Harringtons?" one asked. Michael paused, choosing his words carefully. "This was never about saving the Harringtons," he said firmly. "It was about saving the truth. Justice is not selective. It does not belong to the wealthy or the powerful. It belongs to everyone." His words struck like thunder, echoing through the crowd of journalists and spectators. For the first time, they did not mock or dismiss him. They wrote his words down, eager to share them with the world. Michael walked away, the cameras flashing, but his mind already on something bigger than headlines. His fight was not for applause, it was for change. Later that evening, the Harringtons visited him one final time, their arrogance fully stripped away. Catherine spoke softly, her voice devoid of pride. "We owe you our reputation, Mr. Carter. You have our gratitude." Edward remained silent, his eyes burning with a mix of shame and resentment. Michael listened but did not smile. "You don't owe me gratitude," he replied. "You owe respect. To every person you dismissed, to every voice you silenced. That is the real debt." Catherine lowered her eyes, unable to argue. Michael turned away, signaling the conversation was over. For him, their words meant little. Gratitude without change was hollow, and he refused to be pacified by hollow gestures. His dignity was not for sale, not even to the richest family in the city. That night, Michael returned to his neighborhood, greeted by familiar faces and warm smiles. Children ran to him, shouting his name, their eyes filled with admiration. To them, he was not just a lawyer. He was proof that dreams could defy barriers. His neighbors embraced him, proud that one of their own had stood tall against the powerful. Michael felt a lump in his throat as he looked around, realizing this was his true victory. Not the applause of strangers, not the reluctant gratitude of the Harringtons, but the hope he had ignited in the hearts of his community. For every insult, every humiliation, every attempt to silence him, this moment was the answer. His fight had always been for them. As he sat with friends and family that evening, Michael reflected on the journey. He remembered the jeers, the laughter, the doubt that had nearly broken him. But he also remembered the fire that had kept him standing, the promise to his parents, the belief that truth mattered. Dignity, he thought, is not given by the world. It is claimed. His eyes glistened as he realized the magnitude of what he had achieved. He had not only defended a family who despised him, he had defended the very principle of equality, and in doing so, he had rewritten the story that so many had tried to write for him. He was no longer the underestimated lawyer. He was Michael Carter, the man who refused to be erased. The next morning, newspapers carried his name across their front pages. Underdog lawyer turns trial upside down. Michael Carter, from mockery to mastery. The world that had laughed at him now celebrated him. Yet Michael remained grounded, walking through the streets of his neighborhood with the same humility as before. He knew the battle against prejudice was far from over, but he also knew he had carved a crack in the wall of injustice, a crack wide enough for others to push through. His story was no longer just his own. It belonged to every person told they did not belong. And in that knowledge, Michael found peace. In the quiet of his apartment that night, Michael wrote in his journal, the words flowing like a final verdict. "They mocked me, silenced me, humiliated me. But in the end, they needed me. That is the power of truth. It outlasts arrogance, it outshines prejudice, it outlives hate." He closed the notebook, his heart lighter than it had been in years. Tomorrow would bring new battles, new trials, new insults perhaps. But Michael Carter knew one unshakable truth. He would never again be underestimated. For he had stood in the fire of humiliation and emerged unburned, carrying the torch of justice for all to see.